In my last video, I compared the PlayStation 1 and the Nintendo 64. I went through their hardware, how it affected their games, how the system sold, and other aspects. Then I scored them. The PS1 won due to its better controllers, far better third-party and cross-platform games, along with it being cheaper overall. You see, the PlayStation's launch price was $300 versus the Nintendo 64's $200, but the PlayStation 1 had a price cut in May 1996 to just $200. And the consoles were neck and neck during the 90s price-wise. Whenever one company would try to lower the price, the other one would as well to keep up. And while the consoles were the same price-wise, the largest difference was the cartridges, which would often cost $60 and $80 on the Nintendo 64, and PS1 discs would be between $50 and $20 most of the time. But I don't want to retread old things I've talked about, so today I'd like to go over a small misconception, and then just look over some of the more technical things, why PS1 and Nintendo 64 games were made differently, how that affected them, some padding stuff. But first, a small critique of elitism. I have to admit something. I tried my best specifically not to sugarcoat the issues on the Nintendo 64. I was tired of seeing how many people seemingly misrepresented the true power of both of these systems, often overemphasizing both. And they also didn't talk about how absolutely detrimental the cartridges were. Meanwhile, I really focused on the cartridges because they were really detrimental. I also tried to do my best to showcase how big the PlayStation 1 library of good games is. Here's a wall of good PlayStation 1 games. Anyways, in that, I feel like some viewers were led to believe that I didn't consider those Nintendo games particularly good or something, when I was instead stating that while the Nintendo 64 had really good games, the PlayStation also had a lot of equally good games. Far more, actually. It's not that X game is better than Y game, but there are far more good games on X than Y. And before you say it, shovelware existed on both of these platforms, it's just that you're gonna find far more of it on the PlayStation because there were far more games. My goal is to try to interest people in picking up some PS1 games they would have usually thought nothing of, in hopes they would find something new they'd enjoy. Of course, while reading the comments, it was really nice to read comments from people who shared their own experience owning one or both consoles, and I found a small misconception that I would like to talk about. The first analog thumbstick, so with analog input not a D-pad, was not on the Nintendo 64. It was on this thing. It was a 1989 Mega Drive controller. It's also the first controller with shoulder buttons, funnily enough. It was featured in games like Afterburner, and you really could use it for analog control. It was a very interesting controller, though it was very niche. The Nintendo 64 controller was the first mainstream first-party controller specifically to have a thumbstick, as there was a flight stick made by Sony that released before the Nintendo 64, though the Saturn's analog controller came in like 1 to 2 weeks after the Nintendo 64 did in Japan. Either way, I'd still argue the PlayStation 1 controller wins because literally every other controller was modeled after it, including most modern Nintendo controllers. Being the first at something doesn't really matter as much as being the first who did it well. I'd also like to interject here to tell you to subscribe. Yes, I'm mutating into a YouTuber. It's just positive reinforcement that my choice of hobby is cool. Please. Now, let's go over why these games were so different. Cartridges and CDs were the two biggest and most obvious differences between these two systems, so let's go over them. The PlayStation 1's main issue was the disk speed. A CD could run at 300 kilobytes per second, while a cartridge could hit 5 megabytes. So, of course, the loading times were a thing. I've done some measurements, and loading times often took around 6 seconds for a new level, and around 2 seconds for in-level loading zones, if a game had such structure. But the PlayStation could still load the same levels as the Nintendo 64 did. It would be a little slower, you might need a loading zone trigger in the middle of the level, but it could still do it. The Nintendo 64's issue is there was no alternative, no crutch, no magic trick to fix the gigantic design flaw of the average Nintendo 64 cartridge being 24 megabytes in size, while a single CD was 650 megabytes. There was no way to overcome the, on average, 27 times smaller file size. And the games suffered because of it. We would have less narrative games. We'd have far more games where the main element was just moment-to-moment action. We would have games that would try to utilize most of the worlds they've already made. That's why collectathons were so popular on the console, as linear levels would make every Nintendo 64 game painfully short. Meanwhile, on the PlayStation, games like Crash could just afford to have more levels. Spyro could have tons of collectibles and more stages. Tons of large, story and cutscene heavy, cinematic games ended up flourishing on the PlayStation. And far less of those had the same padding seen in many Nintendo 64 games. But of course, padding was kind of important back in the day, because games weren't really that long back then. People wanted their money's worth out of the games they were buying. That's why Donkey Kong 64 was made the way it was, and it's interesting how the public opinion on that has shifted in the last decade or so. Anyways, I like to split padding between mandatory and optional. Mandatory padding is like Mario 64 kicking you out of a level for every star you get to extend playtime. This is done because if you could grab every star in, let's say, the Bomb Battlefield without getting kicked out of the stage, you could probably beat the stage in like 5 minutes. The 100 coin and 8 red coin stars were also very easy to shove into the game and were probably there to pad out the star roster, though they do reward exploration of the level instead of just beelining to the objective, so they have some value in them. Optional padding is on the other hand like how... Okay, let's go over how Crash Bandicoot works really quickly. So you can just beat the game normally by getting to the end of a level, but you can also get a white gem and a colored gem. You get a white gem by breaking every box in the stage, and you can die if you want, but if you go through a few select levels and destroy every single box without dying, you get a colored gem, and those gems open platforms and other levels, meaning there's this weird sort of post-game progression on how you can get 100% completion, because you have to go to some future levels, then return to some previous ones, then go back to the future ones. You have to do some stuff to get every single crate. Of course, you would also need 2 keys from 2 specific bonus stages, all just to get an alternate ending that the main game doesn't require. Of course, optional padding is annoying for players who just want to 100% a game and be done with it, but especially in the 90s, it was great to have a game give the player extra goals after you're done with the main quest. And that's because people just didn't have as many games as people do today, so it was just nice to be able to do more. Mandatory padding got far more annoying. It was done to increase playtime as well, obviously, but it's just less excusable. Of course, padding was just changed. Before this, you would have difficulty padding, which really wasn't a thing on a lot of games, especially in the Nintendo sphere. So it just made sense for Donkey Kong 64 to be padded out with walking and backtracking instead of just frustratingly hard levels. And while padding was definitely present on both platforms, it is far more prevalent on the Nintendo 64 just because of the small cartridge sizes. Now, let's go over the technological differences that split how the PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64 were often rendered. Even though the PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64 could output a similar amount of polygons per frame, we need to consider 2 things. While the PlayStation 1 used discs, the Nintendo 64 used cartridges. Also, while the Nintendo 64 had perspective-correct texture mapping, the PlayStation had polygonal warping. Of course, because of these 2 factors, the Nintendo 64 games would often just render the entire level at once with large and wide polygons. It would make the area less detailed, but view fog was far less of a factor. Meanwhile, PS1 games had to tessellate polygons so the textures don't appear wonky, and because of that, they could add more detail to a scene. Because they already used up their polygonal budget for the environment around the player, a lot of PlayStation 1 games just had to use some form of distance fog, or they just straight up didn't load polygons far from the player. Spyro was the exception. It had an LOD, or level of detail feature. Basically, there were 2 levels of detail for every level, a higher polygon, textured version, and a low polygon vertex color version. A similar technique is used in a lot of games today, but it wasn't utilized often on the PlayStation 1. Of course, the reason why vertex colors were used is because there's no texture warping if there's no textures, and the PlayStation 1 can draw vertex colors and these kinds of polygons really quickly. That's why it was used. So, let's go with some things that the Nintendo 64 could do that the PlayStation 1 just couldn't. And it's not much. It had a hardware Z buffer, twice the main system RAM though, only 512K more in total. It supported perspective correct texture mapping, and it could load data faster than the cartridge. But that's about it. All of this let game developers avoid loading zones as much, avoid sorting polygons as the console had a Z buffer, organize their game's memory exactly as they wanted to, which was very useful in some RTS games. And they could use less polygons in a given scene because the textures wouldn't be warped. Though of course, that lowered the amount of detail present in a scene. So, on the other hand, let's go over the things the PlayStation 1 could that the Nintendo 64 just couldn't. And that was storing way more data and using multi-disc games. But while this is only one benefit, it's a huge one. What this resulted in was storing far higher quality textures, far more content, being able to stream music directly from the disc, being able to pack more music, stream textures off the disc, stream data, to the point where crash levels could use 30 megabytes of data per scene, which is nearly 4 times the Mario 64 cartridge, by the way. They could just, in the case of Driver or Soul Reaver, load the entire world without any loading zones because the game would just stream data as you're walking around so you can explore the world. Of course, the Nintendo 64 could stream as well, but there wasn't much to stream because the game already had to be such a small size. It'd be much simpler to just load the level into RAM. There wouldn't really be that much to stream. I believe that the PlayStation 1 could have been perfect if it had 4 megabytes of RAM and if it had perspective correct texture mapping, though both of these would have increased the price of the system, and I'm not sure how a $350 console that dropped to $250 when the Nintendo 64 release would have fared in the 90s market. Overall, I want to reiterate that both of these systems were good. The reason why I argued the PlayStation 1 won was entirely because, hey, the Nintendo 64 had a few good games. The PlayStation 1 just had far more of them. Instead of arguing that some game can't hold a candle to Mario, why not pick it up and try it? It won't bite.